All right, here is a short lecture pre-work for Friday 10 to 11 arrhythmia large group session. This is on sinus node dysfunction. The goals are to be able to recognize sinus node dysfunction, pause and block, what a wandering atrial pacemaker, and the syndrome of sick sinus syndrome. So first of all, wandering atrial pacemaker is just what it sounds like. It is a atrial pacemaker that moves around between the sinus node and other sites in the atria and or even the AV junction. And as you recognize, if the sinus mechanism always originates from the sinus node, the P wave is pretty much going to look the same all the time. If the pacemaker site in the atrium swaps around between the sinus node and other spots within the atrium itself, the P wave is going to look somewhat different. Now, in general, it's still going to be upright because the general direction of the atrium towards the AV node is downward, but it may not always be the case. If it originates in the left atrium, let's say, it could be downward and to the right versus in the right atrium downward and to the left. The majority of the time we do see a lot of these wandering atrial pacemakers in the right atrium though, and they swap around in different sites, or it could be just an ectopic site that's always the same. The key feature of this is that the P waves are going to look different from beat to beat. Now some of them may look the same and some may look different. So when you see P waves that are kind of always there followed by a QRS, but the P waves look different on each beat, that could be a sign of a wandering atrial pacemaker. Because the site of the atrial signal could be very low down in the atrium, closer to the AV node, in those cases the PR interval will be shorter because there's less distance to travel between that atrial stimulus and getting to the AV node and then the QRS. If it's up in the sinus node, it's going to be presumably your normal PR interval. So the PR interval will change along with the P waves changing as a wandering atrial pacemaker. Now, typically, this is going to be a fairly normal rate. Might be a little bit slower, but it's generally not what we consider tachycardia. That has a different name when it's fast and has different atrial sites. We'll talk about that in the atrial arrhythmia lecture. So here's our diagram of what you look for to diagnose wandering atrial pacemaker on a rhythm strip or on a 12-lead EKG. So what causes this? Well, as you know, the sinus node is very influenced by the vagus nerve. So high vagal tone can inhibit the sinus node, and maybe other sites in the atrium take over because they're not being stimulated by the sinus node in time. And we also know that respiration has a lot of effect on heart rate, including the sinus node, and that can affect and create some of this problem. It may be a normal finding in children and older adults and well-conditioned athletes that they might have evidence of a wandering atrial pacemaker. So by itself, it doesn't necessarily mean anything problematic. It can also be related sometimes to organic heart disease or certain drugs or toxicity. And this is what real samples would be. Here's a rhythm strip showing the P waves looking quite different from beat to beat, and you notice the PR intervals change with that as well. Okay, normal QRS and a fairly normal rate. Here's a 12-lead EKG, and we're going to look at lead 2. Here's the rhythm strip for lead 2 here, similar to here. And you can see the P waves. That one's different, that one's different, that one's inverted, 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 but here they're upright. And you can see the rate is going to vary a little bit as well, but mostly it's the P waves and the PR intervals. So what's some of the other things that can go on with our sinus node? Well, one of them is called sick sinus syndrome. And sick sinus syndrome can be represented by episodes of sinus bradycardia, meaning you're below 60, which can be normal in many of us, but in general it means rate below 60. The P waves pretty much look the same. They're still coming from the sinus node, but the rate has slowed down. So we just have sinus brady. I'm going to skip these two other and go to here where we have episodes of sinus brady followed by sinus tachycardia. Okay, so we call tachy-brady syndrome is one of the categories of sick sinus syndrome. It really means that your sinus node is kind of either very irritated or trying to stop working. So it has periods of speeding up fast for no reason and periods of bradycardia that alternate. This would be a tachybrady syndrome, or one of the types of sick sinus syndrome. And something we don't really trust this rhythm, because you can see some of these are pretty long pauses. We also have sinus arrest and sinoatrial exit block. So sinus arrest means we're clicking around with our P wave, and then we just don't have a P wave, we don't have a P wave, and it's a pretty long time between this R wave and this R wave. Remember, the QRS complex is what makes your heart beat and eject. So here we have several seconds potentially between this P wave and this P wave. Now, sometimes the junction or the ventricle will just fire on its own because it's not getting stimulated, but sometimes it doesn't. If this pause between P waves is more than 3 seconds, we call that sinus arrest. If it's less than 3 seconds, but there's a pause, then we call it sinus pause. And I'll show you that in the next slide. As I said, sometimes when the sinus node forgets to fire, like here, okay, we might have something else that fires, okay? Here we have basically the P wave, the PR interval is getting shorter and shorter, and then it just forgets to fire, and then we regroup again. So this is really just a sinus pause, and then it takes back over, okay? It's just kind of starting to wear out. It's getting tired. I need a break, and now I'm going to start firing again. I'm going to take another break. But it's a much shorter gap than sinus arrest, okay? So once again, arrest is greater than 3 seconds, pause is less than 3 seconds, okay? And it takes really about 6 seconds of no heartbeat before people are going to start feeling lightheaded and potentially pass out, okay? So you might not notice pauses, but an arrest that's long enough, or multiple periods of arrest within a minute, your cardiac output's definitely going to drop, okay? And here's some just real-life examples. Here we got some P waves. They're kind of wandering. Then we have a gap. Then we have another P wave. We have a junctional escape. We have a long period of no sinus, which is a sinus arrest. And then we have some kind of speeding up here. So this is kind of like a tachybrady syndrome with some sinus arrest. Similar here, we have some kind of periods of bradycardia with pause, some faster rates, another pause, and faster rates. So these are all kind of signs of sick sinus syndrome, okay? Tachybrady with some sinus pauses or arrests. Now, it's important to recognize that sinus pause and sinus arrest is different than heart block, okay? And we'll talk about that in the future. But heart block is when there is a sinus beat or an atrial beat, gets to the AV node, but it doesn't conduct through. And then either the AV node or usually the ventricle itself fires on its own. So you have a disconnection between P waves and R waves. They're not one-to-one. The P waves are just marching through. That's heart block. We'll talk about that in the future. In sinus pause and arrest, you also could be very slow, but you will see a P wave. It's just not conducted. Excuse me, you won't see a P wave. In heart block, you'll see a P wave that's not conducted. In sinus pause and sinus arrest, you won't see a P wave, and that's how you can distinguish the two in part. Also in heart block, depending on what degree, sometimes the QRS can be wide, but a lot of times it can be narrow as well. So it's really the presence or absence of a P wave in a slow rhythm. So what causes sick sinus syndrome? Well, we think it's something that occurs as you get older and or have ischemia, but it's definitely increased in the older population. The incidence of putting pacemakers in older patients is higher, and that's partly just a degenerative fibrosis of your electrical system. Of course, if you've had ischemia, that can contribute to it as well. And of course, any of the infiltrative disease processes here. Obviously, there's other things in terms of neurologic and autonomic dysfunction that can result in it. And then, of course, certain drugs can mimic or exacerbate sick sinus syndrome. So always want to make sure that electrolytes and drugs are considered as well. Sinus node dysfunction, besides potentially creating a very slow bradycardic rhythm, which is not sustainable with good cardiac output, it also puts people at risk for developing supraventricular tachyarrhythmias. The more the sinus node doesn't work well, the more likely another area in the atrium might take over, or that the sinus node is firing at the wrong time, and you get a depolarization signal in part of the atrium, which is still in that vulnerable repolarization state, and it sets up irritability and a fast supraventricular tachyarrhythmia. So it is a risk for that as well. And this is just showing someone who's gotten a pacemaker placed because of sinus node dysfunction and bradycardia. They have an atrial lead here sitting in the atrial appendage, and then another lead going into the ventricle in case the signal doesn't get across. And of course, this person, they also put one into the left ventricle for some reason. And so that is basically sinus node dysfunction. Thank you.